messy. You know, I've found research that shows shy individuals are often more flexible in their thinking. So that's why the shy person kind of sitting in the back of the conference room, not really saying much, or the back of the classroom, actually they don't say much, but then all of a sudden they have these really good ideas. So I thought that was very interesting. Let's see. Oh, we're mostly parents.
Yeah, we're at 98%. Well, Barb, your topics are perfect for what's coming up. Thank you everyone for your shared in the chat. What we might do is I'll do a quick intro to more people join. So first of all, thank you so much for joining, and for those who put stuff in the chat, who shared a bit on the, who shared in the poll. Let's kick off. So I'm Bertie, and I'm MyTutor's co-founder and CEO. We set up MyTutor to inspire, motivate, and support every child to a better future. And we've now delivered over 2 million online lessons since we set out 8 years ago. And we're here this evening as there's a really important gap in the current system around an understanding of how we learn. And so we're delighted to have Professor Barbara Oakley back with us. Barb teaches, I think, probably one of the world's most popular online courses, Learning How to Learn, which has been completed by over 3 million students, alongside your 11 plus books and counting. And since Barbara last spoke to MyTutor parents in March last year, she's launched a new book, an online course of the same name, which is Uncommon Sense Teaching, which is practical insights in brain science to help students learn. And this evening, she's going to share the parts of that which feel most relevant and useful for parents. And so hopefully very targeted to the audience here. And we've left plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So please do share questions along the way in the Q&A box in the bottom bar of your Zoom window. So you'll see next to the chat, there's a Q&A box. If you can leave questions there throughout, it'd be really helpful. The more questions, the better, because we can group into key themes to see the things that will be of most interest to the widest group of people here. So with that, Barb, over to you.
Okay, well, I'm so excited to share here today, and thank you as always for the opportunity, Brittany. I love what MyTutor is doing. It's I wouldn't have made it through school if I hadn't had extra tutoring on the side when I needed it. So, so this is a wonderful. This is a wonderful organization, and it's a privilege to share. So I wanted to begin by just telling you about my favorite athlete of all time is Julius Yego. And Julius is from Kenya. And if you know anything about Kenya, you know they're famous for their long distance runners. If you look at Julius's arms, however, he does not look like a long distance runner. And indeed he isn't. He throws the javelin. And Julius had always wanted to learn how to throw the javelin, but he couldn't afford to go overseas and study. There weren't really, good available javelin throwing tutors in Kenya. So he went online and got tutoring. And he, in the sense of he watched some of the greatest instructors of the javelin. And simply by watching these videos and going out and practicing 99% of the time, he ultimately became the world champion in throwing the javelin. So what this tells you is that there's a lot of things you can do online, even physical learning skills that you might not think you could ever learn. And it's all doable. So a little bit, I think a good thing to do is to share a bit about my own background. I grew up moving all over the United States. And by the time I was about 15 years old, I'd lived in 10 different places. So the thing is that math is very sequential. So when I was 7 years old, we were moving from Texas to Massachusetts. Suddenly they were way far ahead of me in the multiplication tables. I didn't like math anyway. And so I just gave up on it, and I didn't like it, and I didn't do it. And I had no talent at all whatsoever for it. So I flunked my way through elementary, middle, and high school math and science, which is a little ironic, given that I'm speaking with you here today as a distinguished professor of engineering. So one day, though, one of my students had asked me, how'd you change your brain? And I thought about it, and I was this little girl that I loved animals, and I loved knitting and weaving and all those kinds of things. And I knew I could never grow up and do anything technical, because after all, I couldn't do anything in math and science. So I decided to try and learn another language really well. And I know for many of you, that's so easy. But for me, it sounded really interesting. But I couldn't afford to go to college. And so, but I found out there was one way I could learn a language and actually get paid for it. And that was to join the Army. So there you see me looking really nervous, about to throw a hand grenade. And if you knew how clumsy I am, you would know why I look so nervous. But I did learn another language. I learned Russian, and I ended up working out at sea on Soviet trawlers. There's me on lots of fish. And I also ended up, just because I loved new perspectives and having new adventures, I ended up at the South Pole Station in Antarctica, and that's where I met my husband. So I do like to say I had to go to the end of the earth to meet that man. But the thing is, here is the reality, which I was completely unaware of as a young person. If you have expertise that includes a fundamental ability with, the foundations of math, all career doors are open for you. If you only have verbally oriented skills, about maybe a third of really interesting career doors are open for you now. There's so much opportunity if you have a reasonably good technical, the foundation, so that you can learn in technical disciplines. This does not mean you have to be an engineer and live in a cubicle the rest of your life. But if you're able to have that verbal ability and also include mathematical, expertise or foundations, all career doors are open for your children. So I do have to say, so I'm a parent, and I knew that I wanted our two daughters to have all career doors open for them. And so I knew that there was not enough practice given in the American school systems. And I know it's pretty much like that in the United Kingdom. And so I put my children in an extra practice institution called Kumon Mathematics, Kumon. And there is a related discipline called or a company called Smartick, Smartick, or even better, you can use MyTutor. But what can be very helpful is that little bit of additional practice on a daily basis. It's much like learning mathematics is much like learning a musical instrument. And it can be super, super helpful for your children's long-term expertise. For our own children, our older daughter was terrible at math, couldn't get it, and she was very slow, and you had to explain everything. She was not gifted in math. Well, she recently finished her medical school residency at Stanford, which is, that extra bit of math really gave her the foundation she needed. And then our younger daughter hated math. I had to drag her every day an extra 20 minutes of math practice, most days. It was kicking and screaming, and it was usually kind of a little bit of a trouble to get her to get this extra tutoring. And she she ended up getting her degree in art. And then she got out into the working world and she saw what that was like. And so now she is just completing her master's degree in statistics and she loves math. So, so just that little bit of extra practice each day can make an enormous difference, or, most days. And it really can, even for children who seem to have no gift at all in a certain area, it still gives them the foundation they need to open all career doors. But let's look inside the brain and see a little bit of what is going on so we can better understand why that little bit of extra practice, whether it's learning a language or learning in math or learning how to play a musical instrument or whatever you're learning, why it's so helpful. Now, if you look, the brain is really complicated, but its fundamental building block is the neuron. And it's, it's got, well, I know you're thinking this is where she gets into the boring scientific part. So let's spice it up a little bit. Here's our analogy or a metaphor for our neuron. It's a space alien. It's got 3 legs with some toes on it. Those are like dendrites on a real neuron with lots of toes on them. And I mean, it's a space alien, so you can have these extra toes. And then it's got an arm that reaches up, that's called an axon. And the whole thing that neurons do is they simply, they reach out and they touch and tickle the toe of an adjoining neuron. And what this is actually doing is it's making neural connections between, and sending signals between those neurons. So that's all it's doing. It's sending an electrical signal that jumps this little gap called the synapse with neurotransmitters and then goes and travels to the next neuron. And when you learn something, all you're really doing is making a nice connected set of neurons because you've learned something. So these neurons reside in long-term memory. Those connections strengthen with practice. This is why that daily practice idea is so very important. And ultimately what you have is something that's kind of like a set of links that the more you practice, the stronger and richer those sets of links become, and you can pull them more easily to mind and work with those ideas. For example, if you know multiplication well, you can easily pull links to mind and do multiplication problems, do fractions, and related algebra problems. So people often think that they know what the best technique is for learning. I'm going to give you 4 commonly used techniques. And in your mind, if you would come up with which approach you think is the most effective. Is it rereading? I mean, I reread all the time, underlining or highlighting, it's emphasizing how important something is, right? You're repeating it. Retrieval practice or recall, which is like using flashcards to see if you can remember something. Or is it creating a concept map like this, where you draw a map of all those key ideas? So hopefully you have in mind which one is the best, because there is one approach here that is better by far than any other approach, and that is retrieval practice. Why is that? Because when you are initially learning something, like I'm explaining these ideas to you now, there's some faint sets of links that are arising in your brain because of what I'm saying. But the more you kind of withdraw those links, like access them and remember them, the stronger those sets of links become. So it's this is really at the heart of good learning, is retrieval practice. And a great way to prepare for tests is to do retrieval practice of those key ideas. practice tests, of course, with the key ideas are invaluable in helping retrieve what those key ideas actually were. So if you're not practicing though, if let's say you learn a new idea and then you don't go over it for like a couple weeks or maybe even longer than that, your little synaptic janitors will sweep those dendritic spines away. And when you go to look at something you knew before, you can't remember it because those links have been swept away. So if you look at learning before, before sleep, before you've actually learned something, if you look at a dendritic or a dendrite before learning and before sleep, you can see this living dendrite through a light microscopy image. And I'm going to show you a light microscopy image of the same exact living neuron after learning and after sleep. So take a look here. Look at this. We've got right here, and then notice there's no dendritic spine right here. So during sleep, this dendritic spine emerged and has connected with another neuron. And this indeed is the learning process that occurs during sleep. So sleep is actually a very important aspect of learning. In fact, one of the best things you can do with your children is, of course, they should be studying during the day, but right before they go to sleep at night, you would like them to just like take 2, 3, 5 minutes and go over in their brain the key ideas they want to really remember or understand, even if they don't understand them yet. Just to kind of get that in mind. And what will happen during sleep is the brain will send electrical signals over and over and over along those pathways. And those will help to consolidate and allow that student to either better remember or better understand the ideas that they're trying to remember or understand. Incidentally, this idea that retrieval practice is really valuable, you might think, oh, well, yeah, it's just memorization. It doesn't make for real understanding. Au contraire, the research that was done in this area, published in top research journals like Science, shows that not only is memory improved for that topic, but understanding of those topics, those concepts, is also incredibly much more improved than any other technique. So retrieval practice is really important. And we often kind of tend to avoid it because it's harder, but it's actually the most effective way to learn. So when we're learning something, it's important to space out our learning. So if you have, for example, 5 hours to learn something, it's much better to do an hour here, an hour the next day, an hour the next day through the week, than to cram 5 hours, for example, in one day. When you do this cramming like this, it makes a poor foundation that's much easier for those little neural links to get swept away. And part of what's going on is, look at this. If you do an hour of study on French, and maybe that same day later, you do an hour of study on, say, calculus. So what happens is for each one, you're actually, when you go to sleep that night, you're able to strengthen those neural links. The next day, same thing happens, So even though you're studying, like maybe during the 5 hours you have, or 3 hours of study time you have available, if you split it between the topics and make sure you're studying each topic each day, you have time to sort of consolidate during sleep. And it's like double the impact of the time that you've been putting into each topic. So it's a little bit like laying a brick wall. When you're if you're building a brick wall, you lay the bricks, mortar, but before you go too high, you let that mortar dry. It takes time to build that brick wall. If you don't, what happens is sort of this jumbled mess that's a very poor foundation for learning. So this indeed can be why it can be so valuable to space out that learning. It just takes time. Muscular structure and neural structure are both types of cells they're excitable tissues. And so it takes time. So that's why, just as it took time for this weightlifter to develop this kind of muscular structure, it takes time to develop neural structure. It's just that we can't see inside our brains to know that that is actually what is taking place. So one of the biggest challenges for students, however, is the fact that they like to procrastinate. And don't we all? I mean, because when you're doing something, you're not doing something else. And it turns out that procrastination is when we even just think about something we don't like or don't want to do, it activates a part of the brain called the insular cortex. And that is where we experience pain. So often what we'll do is, because we experience pain, we just turn our minds to something else. And that makes us feel happier, at least temporarily. But, bottom line is you procrastinate once or twice, no big deal. You procrastinate very often, and it can kill your chances for being successful in the subjects that you're trying to study, because few people can work under that kind of highly stressful condition. So even if you have the capability of being successful, if you wait until the last minute to study, you're going to make things much increasingly difficult. So I'm an engineer, so I'm going to cut to the chase. What's the best way to handle this kind of, avoiding procrastination? It is Francesco Cirillo's Pomodoro technique. This technique is so simple. All you have to do is just, first off, turn off all distractions. So cell phone, best in the other room, unless you're using it as the timer. And no pop-ups on the computer, no distractions. If you've got earphones, put them on. If you have a 2-year-old in the house, well, good luck with that. But do your best to get all the distractions, away from the person who's doing the studying. Set a timer for 25 minutes and then focus as intently as you can for those 25 minutes, and then give yourself a reward. 5 minutes of, it is best 5 minutes of just relaxation, mental relaxation. That does not mean going to your cell phone and checking your text messages and then seeing, oh, wait a minute, there's a text message from so-and-so. And then you get on and you're trying to respond. That means you're going back into focusing. It turns out if you take that little break, that is invaluable in allowing the hippocampus to offload the information or reinforce the information you've just learned that's being, that is kind of weakly set into neural links in long-term memory in the neocortex. So in other words, that 5-minute break of, you're like sitting there doing nothing, relaxing, maybe having a cup of tea, listening to your favorite song or something like that, is actually also an important time for learning. We used to think learning only took place when you're sitting there, busting yourself out to try to make yourself focus on things. But it also occurs when you are just relaxing. And in fact, that's how that information is consolidated in long-term memory. So that 5-minute reward period is also invaluable. Pomodoro, I cannot recommend it more highly. Oftentimes, what people will recommend is something like, this maybe 3 Pomodoros, do the 4th, and then after that, 4th, after the 3rd or so, you might take a longer break, maybe a half an hour. So 5-minute breaks in between for 3, and then a longer break of half an hour. So that's if you have a lot of studying to do. Kids who start learning how to use the Pomodoro technique they just often really love it. Children with ADHD are really particularly enamored of this technique, and it's because it's geared for them. The first thing that a person with ADHD needs to do is get rid of distractions, because they're super easily distractible. So if you can just even start with that idea and then get to work with that, it's super helpful. So if let's return to my hero, Julius Yigo. And Julius, of course, learned how to throw the javelin well. And he was really a genius in how he approached this. And the reason is this. So he would look at what was going on on the screen, and then he would go out and he would practice. So he was getting this explicit instruction, then he was practicing and reinforcing those sets of links. But it's more than that, really. What he was actually doing was a mixture of, he was getting explicit instruction, that is lecture, and he was actively learning. And he was going back and forth between getting instruction into his brain and then practicing. That is almost like a retrieval practice to bring it out of his brain. And it turns out that this combination of a mixture going back and forth between lecture and active learning is called direct instruction, and it is one of the best ways possible to learn. For years, people have been saying, oh, no, we have to have active learning all the time. Well, no, I mean, if you're active learning, if you're always using constructivist approaches, which are good, but if you need to have some actual explicit instruction to kind of guide you and keep you going. But so if this is direct instruction, if this is one of the best ways for students to learn, what is actually going on in the brain during this time? Well, remember how I talked about these sets of links in long-term memory? They are deposited through two different pathways. The first pathway takes information from working memory through the hippocampus into long-term memory. That's called the declarative pathway. The second type of links are laid through the basal ganglia, and that is called the procedural pathway. And these two different pathways are both, the links from both pathways are needed for students to be able to excel at whatever they're learning, whether it's math, language, riding a skateboard, or whatever. These two pathways are so important. I'll just give you a very, very quick overview of, what's the difference between these pathways. Well, you're not really conscious of what you've learned procedurally. So, but you're conscious of what you learn, what I'm explaining to you. You practice to develop your procedural understanding. You can't really explain very well. That's why a child may be able to solve a Rubik's Cube, but not be able to explain it. Or they may be able to solve, in their native language, they can do certain formulations, but they can't tell you why they do it. Procedural learning is not just rote learning. It's super important for very, very complicated topics, including complex patterns such as your native language. It's really slow to learn procedural learning because you got to practice a lot. But once you practice, like with a keyboard, you can use it really quickly. Declarative is the other way around. You can learn it very quickly, but you have to think about it. That's why speaking a foreign language, which you learn declaratively, is often slower for you. And this procedural learning is also less flexible, and declarative is more flexible. And so what that does is that if you have a balance of both types of learning, it actually is just fantastic for students because they can be flexible and fast in what they're learning. Retrieval practice, as we've just discussed, is super good for developing both types of sets of links. So is spaced repetition and explanation helps declarative learning, whereas practice and interleaving, and by interleaving, I mean mixing up topics that are closely related, such as present tense in verbs and past tense in verbs is really super important. So as I'm wrapping up here, I just want to remind you of the importance of the neurodiverse students that we're often working with. Here we see my favorite science fiction author when I was a young person. That's Octavia Butler, who suffered or has dyslexia. Of course, Elon Musk is thought to have and has talked a bit about, he has a bit of Aspergery tendencies or autistic spectrum nowadays. It's referred to. Marie Curie was the same, as was Einstein. So whether you have your child has ADHD or dyslexia, as with Octavia Butler or with Steven Spielberg, or many other seeming learning disorders, I can tell you that for virtually every type of disorder, there has been a Nobel Prize winner who has won that Nobel Prize because of the, being seemingly weak or weak in one area can actually help expand other areas and make your thinking really unusual, creative, and a wonderful thing for society as a whole. So the world needs fast, slow learners, like race car learners, and also slower learners. I call them hiker learners like me. And it turns out that, like race cars, everything goes by in a blur. Hikers can reach out, touch the leaves on the trees. They can hear the birds, see the rabbit trails, completely different experience. And in some ways, much richer and deeper. In fact, these slower learners are so important, as well as the fast learners, because the slower learners are often more accurate and they're more flexible. Just to give you a quick sense of that, a slower learner, they learn something during the day and their little dendritic spines have grown out, but look at this, they fall away, and then they go to sleep at night and they've got to relearn it the next day. Whereas the fast learner, look at this, they remember everything. The slower learner gets up the next day and says, okay, I've got to relearn this stuff. But they're more flexible. As it turns out, when you learn and it fixes, it can make you more rigid in your thinking. So, as I would just like to close with my wonderful hero in science, who is Santiago Ramon y Cajal. And Cajal was asked, he was a terrible learner growing up. He was super slow, had lots of trouble, got kicked out of some schools because he not only was a slow learner, but he was a troublemaker. And he won the Nobel Prize and is now considered the father of modern neuroscience. He was asked, how did this happen? You were so terrible. And he said, well, number one, I was persistent. So he practiced, he repeated, and he built those and strengthened those sets of links. The other thing, though, was he said I was flexible. When the data told me I was wrong, I could change my hypothesis. He said, I was no genius, and he was not. But he said, I've worked with many geniuses. And the challenge with geniuses is because, of their race car brains, they jump to conclusions. And then when they're wrong, they can't change their mind. So if you or your child is no genius, rejoice, because sometimes they will be able to do things that even geniuses cannot. So with that, I'd like to thank you so much to MyTutor and to Birdie. And all I can say is make great use of what they have to give, because it will really be helpful for your children.
Thank you so much for that, Barb. I will be coming straight back to you with picking up some of the questions from the chat. I think one of the main things that in the chat was just how many people were asking you for a recording. So clearly it was landing and resonating with a lot of people. So that was brilliant. So what I'll do is there are 3 questions in the Q&A at the moment, a couple of early ones. And then there's been a bit of chat, a few questions that came through the chat as well. One of the things that seemed to be resonating a bit was around motivation. I think we saw something like a little earlier from Robert, Assie, and Charlotte and Sarah, which is getting a bit of traction. Like it can be hard to motivate a teen. Do you have any questions? Do you have any advice, Barbara, around how to motivate somebody to learn?
Okay, so this is the magic question that everyone is interested in. And of course, neuroscience does not yet have a magic bullet that can solve this. Internal motivation is the key. But at the same time, I would like to say that a lot of the previous theories on motivation are actually not being borne out by neuroscience. So for example, people have long thought that, like, if you are externally motivating your children, that is by, giving them a reward or something like that to do something, that is a terrible thing. And it should always come from within the child. And then how do you get it within the child? Well, neuroscience is showing that actually, the external motivation, sure, it's the external and internal motivation are really pretty much the same thing. It's a motivation. And whether it's because you're given a child, a half an hour to play on their video game if they do something, or they intrinsically would like to do that because they just love doing their homework, that it's actually, the motivation is the same in either case. And it's perfectly fine to use extrinsic motivators. And I'll give an example. So our younger daughter, she was like so hard to motivate about anything. She was a classic example of the hard to motivate child. And so we wanted her to become a reader, or start reading more. So we gave her a small financial reward whenever she read a book, and it could be like a little book, just one of the kids' books and so forth, but we would give her this little reward. And we kind of kept track of things. And so she started reading books, and because she started reading books because of our external rewards, it started getting easier for her. And because it started getting easier for her, and she began to see the interesting things that you could find in books, she became internally motivated over time. Now, it's easier to do this with reading because reading tells stories and all that kind of stuff. And it's harder to do this with math because math gets exciting. For some kids, math gets exciting like when you're, into past calculus and up in the upper levels. It's hard to, it's like riding a bicycle is difficult at first, but kids will do it even though they know they're going to get, they're going to fall down, they're going to get hurt and so forth. They do it because they can see that there's really some fun stuff at the other end. Math is harder to get that with because you can't, it's a mental sort of thing. So in that case, you just have to use every potential trick you can and realize that it's bit by bit over a number of years. That's actually what's going to make the difference. But although you will see bit by bit, even after a couple of months, you'll start seeing a real difference. So bit by bit, that just means whatever works for your child, whether it's a little bit of video games or take them to the park if they do it every day, by the end of the week, or you're going to play with them, play a game with them, or whatever it takes. Just do the bit by bit daily motivation, and don't be worried if that intrinsic, oh, I just love doing my algebra homework, doesn't seem to appear. For our daughter Rachel, she hated math all through high school, and now she loves math, and she's getting her master's in statistics. So it can really change. But it's a little bit like saying, I want my child to be prepared to go into society because I want them to be able to speak nicely with others, to to play well, to interact nicely. You teach them social skills, but you also want to teach them, actual skills like how do you write effectively? How do you do mathematics effectively? Even simply knowing enough math to know how to calculate a mortgage payment, with a controlled study, has shown that people are far more likely to, to have a good life. They don't default on their mortgage. So just that simple math training can make an enormous difference. And I tend to harp a little bit on math training, just because we don't get enough of that in the West. There's just not enough practice. If I was in China, on the other hand, though, I would be harping on metaphor and learning in the humanities more. So sometimes I think we have much to learn from Asian approaches, which are not all good, especially in the idea that the teacher is all knowing and all perfect. But they have some very, very good approaches that we can benefit, just as they have good approaches, we have good approaches that can benefit their learning as well.
Our next question, which I think is going to be, having seen the initial chat with a lot of people with sort of exam age children, and this is the first time in the UK we've got sort of public exams coming after the pandemic. Charlotte, who, alongside putting bangers and mash on the table as we started, has also asked us a bit about talked about how a pandemic might affect children's learnings, but particularly called out that they've got exams coming up. And so for people who've had a bit of a break from public exams and who maybe had their learning interrupted, do you have any sort of exam preparation tips for the audience?
So the more you can do practice exams that are similar, the better off you're going to be. And also try to do those practice exams not just at home. Do them in different places, like a library, or, so because when you're practicing and studying for examinations and you're doing it all in one place, you actually kind of pick up parts of that place, and that helps spur your memory. And then if you're not in that place, it's tougher to retrieve things. Do as much retrieval practice as you possibly can. When the exam is about to take place, or actually you can start practicing this a little earlier. So in other words, what you would like to do is be sure to practice with breathing techniques. So a good idea, so what you really want to do is, and this can make such a big difference, because you know how it is. You get a test in front of you, and then you can feel all those stress, cortisol is exploding through your brain and body, and you're just all on fire, and you're wired, and you're so nervous, and it's really hard to think. But you can control that to a great extent by simply doing breathe in. So take a big breath and then breathe all the way out, and try to make your belly kind of stick out a little bit. And what that's really doing is drawing breath way down deep in the diaphragm. When you get very nervous, what can happen is you'll do this sort of panicked kind of breathing where you're breathing very shallowly. And that doesn't get enough, of the respiratory, the oxygen, and the other gases that you need. And so this breathing technique of simply breathing deep, having this go, your stomach go out, so to speak, can really help calm. So practicing with this technique, even if, a few days or even a few weeks beforehand, so that it seems quite normal right before the test is being administered, to relax into this breathing technique. And then that will help you to, tackle the exam better. I don't know how things are geared, whether it's one at a time, but if you're given several pages of information, scan over all the questions and pick the hardest problem first, and just get started on that, and pull yourself off as soon as you get stuck, which is we're talking maybe 30 seconds to a minute. Work on easy problems, go back later and that will help you. You can actually, you're working at consolidating, and you're working in the background on that first problem. So pulling yourself off, doing easier problems, then come back, you actually can get much further than if you save the hardest problem for last. So those are my quick bits of advice.
Thanks, Barb. And to pick up on your slide on neurodiversity, I saw a few, as people were introducing themselves at the start, I saw a few people talk about having teens with dyslexia and chats similarly with ASD. Do you have advice for how to help teens with dyslexia or ASD to learn?
So interestingly, so I talked about the procedural and the declarative learning systems. There's evidence that those with dyslexia may have problems with their procedural learning system, whereas those with the autism or with the, who are on the autistic spectrum, they may or may not have problems with the declarative system, but they for sure usually have a really strong procedural system. So dyslexia, kind of prefers declarative. Autistic spectrum is more procedural. So this means that when I did those slides about different ways that people learn most effectively, that's that gives you a sense of, I mean, I don't want to get into the learning styles argument, because in the quite rightly in the research community, there's been much discussion and dissension about the idea that there are learning styles, in that research does not bear out that, for example, some people might learn better by visual learning while others learn better by hearing. So that may be the case, but it's not what research is showing. People who think they learn better visually, for example, don't seem to do better learning visually, than they learn audibly. So what you think you are is not necessarily what you are. So, that's the sort of the learning styles argument. But if you approach things from the fact that some people do definitely have more of a bent towards procedural type of ways of learning versus declarative, that I think that can help inform things. I know what you want is actual practical advice to help your children. The bottom line is, well, I think it's as Steven Spielberg, who has dyslexia himself, just said, don't let it stop you. You will not be able to change the fact that you have dyslexia, but run between the raindrops and you can still get to where you want to go. For those with ADHD, there's some evidence that as you mature, you can grow out of it. But for youngsters with this condition, our own tendencies are to avoid any kind of medication. But there's some evidence that if you are on the right amount of medication that is, continually adjusted, that what that does is kind of open up neural pathways that they couldn't access before, so that they can start accessing these pathways early on, and in that way start getting them going. Because if you're maturing out of ADHD and let's say you're 15, well, some pathways you're not going to be able to really strengthen as easily as you could when you were younger. So there is some reason for, using medication, if it's controlled and it's and you monitor it and you taper off at the appropriate times.
Building on that, you talked about the role of sleep, and you're talking about medication for certain situations. I get one of the questions in the chat, and I'm going to take maybe one, maybe two more questions until we go out, was about the role of nutrition. Is there something you've looked at about the role of nutrition and how that can help with mood, anxiety, or motivation in learning?
Oh gosh, that's such a fraught area because, of course, there's so many different approaches. One a very good book that I recommend is something called I believe it's Super Gut is the name of the book. Let me see if I can find it here. And nutrition does really matter. But there are so many different approaches. But what Supergut is talking about is a lot of the recent findings, which are really well grounded, that it's actually our gut biome which is affected by what kinds of foods we eat, that can have a huge effect on our mood, on our sort of our general feelings, on whether we're depressed in general or anxious and things like this. So I would say that if you're, take a look at this Super Gut. So it has some, I think, fairly commonsensical approaches to, how to look at diet not from the perspective of, don't eat tomatoes or something like that, or but more towards just sort of how do you create a really beneficial gut biome. And that has a lot to do with our cognition, surprising amounts to do with our cognition.
So I got one final question, Barb. I'm going to share with you maybe, because I know you'll like it, talk to your building a wall and your spaced repetition, talking about building a good revision timetable. So a question from Sarah on the Q&A thread. How can I help my daughter build a good revision timetable?
Oh, with the timetable? I would say look at Smartick. They have some pretty clever gamified ways of learning. And because what you really want is enough repetition that it comes automatically so that you're procedurally fluent. And just by gamifying, you can really get kids to get faster, and they win little awards, and there's little sound prizes and all of that kind of thing. So that can be a very useful tool. Any math game that's gamified, and an online math game can be, I think, very useful for multiplication tables. Hopefully you also know that idea of it's easy to teach the nines, because let's say, how does it work? So let's say, so this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Here's the number 7. 7 times 9 is 63. So it's whatever's on this side. So let's say it's 7, or let's say I picked 5. So 5 times 9, what is that? 45. So that's an easy way to teach how the nines work. And all of a sudden, they can be much faster with the nines.
We've got 4 minutes. I'm probably going to use 2 or 3 minutes to wrap up at the end. Is there anything final? Let's have a quick look if there's anything else that's a common theme of first. There's a question of how involved we should be as parents, but I think that parenting advice might take us over the minutes. What I'll do, I'll wrap up. I can see, and then if we've got time at the end for chats for anyone who can go beyond 8 p.m, we can stay for a minute or two. But so thank you everyone for joining. MyTutor's here to inspire, motivate, and support every child to a better future. And as we said, there's a big gap in learning how to learn. But Barb's work really helps with that, and she's written and published some great materials. We'll send around both the recording of this and links to Barb's latest book at the end of this. I mean, some big themes came out on motivation, on spaced repetition. I think taking 2 to 3 minutes, or taking the time after this session to think about the 2 to 3 things we want to take away to help us remember them is going to serve us well. So really pleased you joined us, and thank you everyone for all your questions, for your comments in the chat, and we hope to see another one of these soon. There's going to be an exit survey, which I think we're going to be posting up now, just to check how you found this evening. So if you do have time just to fill that in, please do. We'd really appreciate it. But other than that, I think we're going to be wrapping up on time for everyone. Great. So I think people are going to be dropping off now. And I think that's all the content, everything we're doing, the recording.